Welcome to the Integrate 2021 Keynote. Just like earlier Integrate conferences, we are happy that we have Jon Fancey doing the keynote with us. To make it easier for Jon to switch between him and his guests in 3 different time zones, the keynote has been recorded earlier. Meanwhile, Jon and his whole team are waiting in the Q&A to chat with you and to take your questions. A warm welcome please for Jon Fancey and his friends.
Hi, I'm Jon Fancey. I'm the Group PM Manager for Azure Integration Services at Microsoft. This past year has seen unprecedented events impacting every single one of us on the planet. We're living in an age of accelerating change where we're having to deal with unexpected situations increasingly unexpectedly. We're having to find new ways of adapting to the challenges that this is bringing quicker than ever before. Integration is the key to enabling us to respond to the change that's occurring confidently and embracing the future, whatever it brings. We are on a journey to help every person be a better integrator. Welcome to Integrate 2021. We know this is not always easy. There's too much to do. You feel like you're getting stuck in analysis paralysis, whether to lift and shift, modernize, or rewrite. Dealing with competing priorities and how you support the old while building the new. Heterogeneous environments of different applications written in different technologies and different eras. There's overwhelming choice. You have to orientate yourself to where you're at right now, not where you wish you were or need to be. How do you find prescriptive guidance and best practices to accelerate your journey and start with confidence so you don't repeat the mistakes that others have made before you? Because it can feel like there's long-term consequences making technology choices. Kubernetes is powerful, but can also feel very complex. And that crushing complexity can feel very real. Cloud-native application development today is too hard. Everyone has skills gaps and is trying to hire people who've done this before and have proven how to do it effectively. So it creates this conundrum of how do you get the power and simplicity of serverless and PaaS with the future-proof open portability of technologies like containerization and Kubernetes. We built Azure Integration Services with many of these challenges in mind. We wanted to bring together the integration capabilities in Azure into a comprehensive, cohesive, and complete set of services. And last week, we introduced Azure Application Services, built on similar principles of how we can solve the complexity problem of building modern cloud-native applications, where you can build out front ends using Azure Web Apps, integrate those using APIs, or respond to real-time events, and plumb in the code you write in the language you want to write it in, using serverless principles so you pay for what you use, and orchestrate those APIs that you've implemented using workflow to be able to visualize it as the complexity increases. Azure Application Services is intended to help you accelerate your development with our turnkey services and provide that productivity of PaaS and control of Kubernetes. But it also allows you to be able to build applications and run them anywhere using Azure Arc. We've all heard a lot about cloud native. And to me, it's really about how we drive that business transformation that we need. And it's the intersection of technology and process, not just technology alone. It consists of technology, yes, things like microservices and containers that allow you to implement APIs that create a composable and rearrangeable set of functionality that's reusable in different contexts in your organization to solve different problems more quickly than you could before. Being able to use things like Azure Functions to write in your language of choice rather than what we dictate. And then using DevOps principles, which is critical to how I can reliably and predictably move from development to production. Because if I can master that, I can do it more often. And if I can do it more often, I can respond to change more quickly. And I can also do it more incrementally so that risks I'm taking every time I deploy decrease dramatically, encouraging me to do even more and creating a virtuous cycle of continuous development and improvement. One that's particularly interesting in the context of integration is microservices. Because when you look at microservices through the lens of integration and how those widgets of functionality interact with one another using APIs. It can look a lot like workflow, where perhaps I have a stimulus event that causes an execution to start and then goes off to various backend systems, retrieves data, updates lines of business, sources of record, and ultimately implements a business process for me. Integration can be the backbone of that digital transformation, providing composition and agility as the critical enablers. Workflow through this lens is the application's spine that joins all the various components together and makes it manageable and visualizable. Using APIs and microservices, you can connect apps and data together with no-code productivity. You can build and deploy and manage holistically using Azure wherever you deploy using Arc. So you have a single pane of glass over your applications and integrations that power them without introducing that complexity. Let's have a look at this in action. I'm going to hand you over to Lyons, who's going to show Azure Integration Services in Arc.
Okay, so here we are in the Azure portal, and it's super simple to get started with Logic Apps and the rest of the Azure Integration Services ecosystem. To create a new Logic App, we can drill in here, we can see all our existing Logic Apps, and we can easily create a new Logic App either in the consumption SKU, which you might already be used to, and our new standard SKU that we released last week. So let's create a new standard Logic App and talk through some of the new benefits you get from the new platform. As any other Azure resource, I'm going to point this to a resource group where this will live. I'm going to give it a name. Let's call it Integrate Logic App. Point it at a region that I would like this to run. In this case, I'm in Australia, so I'm going to run this in Australia Southeast. For hosting, we can choose a storage account, which actually stores all our Logic App state and execution history. This is different to the consumption SKU where we abstract that all away. Now you have the keys to the kingdom. In terms of the plan type, we run our Logic Apps on a workflow standard SKU, which you can scale up in terms of how much compute and memory you need, or you can choose to scale out in terms of how many instances of that workflow you need running at any one time. In terms of monitoring, we now have support for application insights, which means we can get a really rich application map for everything going on in our integration layer. And I'm going to hook this up into a pre-existing one that I have created earlier called Integrate. So we're going to get a really rich map at the end of this. Then I hit next, and go ahead and create a Logic App. Now, rather than me going and creating that and developing it via the portal, which most people would be used to, I'm now going to demonstrate some of our new local development functionality that we have available with the new standard SKU. So here I am in VS Code, and I've gone and created a new Logic App project here locally. Now, to do that, all I need to do is download the Logic Apps VS Code extension, hit that Azure tab, and go and create a new project here. For now, let's create a new workflow. I'm going to make this stateful, and I'm going to call this Integrate Workflow. There we go. All right, in this case, I'm going to paste in a workflow that I have configured earlier. Now, we could work in JSON, but Logic Apps, we love the designer, so why not design right alongside our code here. So here is that workflow that I just pasted in. It's doing a couple of simple things here. When a HTTP request is received, it's going to call out to an Azure function. It's then going to execute a query against my SQL database. Once it's executed that correctly, it's going to send a message out to my service bus so that downstream services can pick it up and process that further. And then it's going to respond back to the sender so it knows that this was successful. So now we can go ahead and add some new functionality in here. Now, there's a whole bunch of things that we can do here. And we can choose what actions we want to build, either built-in actions or our Azure connections. Now, the difference between built-in and Azure connections, built-in connections, which I'm using here, actually run locally in the Logic App process itself, which gives us a couple of benefits. One, we get better performance due to proximity with the Logic Apps engine, and two, they're super simple to DevOps because we don't have to manage them as a separate Azure resource. They're actually built into the project itself. For my Azure connections, these are the connections that you know and love today, the 450 plus strong ecosystem that we have with Azure Logic Apps, connecting us to all of our different SaaS applications without us having to write that implementation code ourselves. So we can add some conditional logic in this case. Let's add a condition. Let's say if the body of my Azure function request contains integrate. This is where we can use the new drag and drop functionality to go and drag in our different items in here. Let's say we're happy with this, we're ready to save it and give it a test. Now, the benefit of the new runtime is that you can now locally dev and test this completely locally and outside of Azure, rather than having to develop and test against a live resource. This makes it really great for developers to jump in, build their workflows, and then deploy them once they're confident with their code. And we've got things like breakpoint debugging, so you can actually get really granular views with the inputs and outputs, as well as your rich run history, so you can drill in to see what's happening, and of course turn on mock responses if you don't have a resource to develop against. So let's say that we've built that out, we're happy with it, and we're ready to deploy. Now, as mentioned before, we can use the Logic Apps extension to deploy this straight to Azure. So we could deploy from here. This is where we can take advantage of the new standard SKUs capabilities for DevOps in your Logic Apps. So in this case, rather than straight deploying from VS Code itself, I'm going to do what a typical developer would do and push up that new functionality. As you can see, we've got that new workflow that we've just created. I'm going to deploy that to my source code repository. So in this case, I'm connected to GitHub, so I'm using the built-in GitHub connections for VS Code. I'm going to give this a commit message. Oops. I'm a developer, not a speller. All right, so I'm going to commit that to my source code repository. So I've given that a bit of time to go ahead and push. Now I'm navigating across to my GitHub repository. I'm going to refresh that, and as you can see, I've got that new commit reflected here. Now to call out, before I go through the pipelines, you don't have to use GitHub as your DevOps tool of choice. I've just happened to use it because it has great first-class integrations with the Azure ecosystem. In this case, I have some GitHub actions that I've configured up to take my Logic Apps project, which I have here, zip it up and deploy it to my pre-existing Logic Apps. And now, as you can see, there's no ARM templates in sight for this particular demo, thus showing that you can actually fully develop your workflows in complete isolation to all the infrastructure pieces that you typically have to manage in your consumption SKU. So if you flick over to actions, that new pipeline has run based on that new commit that I've made a minute ago. So while that goes and runs, I'm going to go and jump in to show what that pipeline looks like. So it's actually doing some generic steps. All it's doing is it's zipping up all my files into a build artifact, and then it's going to go ahead and deploy that to my Logic App, which I already have on Azure, using the Azure function GitHub action. But what happens if I want to deploy that to other locations, not just on Azure? What happens if I have a staging environment on Azure where I do all my testing, but my actual production environment runs on premises next to my actual live SQL server? Well, in this case, this is where we can deploy to Azure Arc enabled Kubernetes clusters. Now, as part of our announcement at Build, you can now run your Logic Apps, your Azure Functions, your Web Apps, Event Grid, and API-M resources on Arc-enabled Kubernetes clusters. Now, I have one already available here, which is that custom location, which I can deploy to. Essentially, think of that custom location as a whole new Azure region that you can deploy to, but it's completely controlled by your operations and your infrastructure people. So I now have full control about my infrastructure, but I treat my Logic Apps exactly the same. Write once, run everywhere. So in this case, I have a production step in my DevOps process, which is exactly the same as staging. The only difference is it's pointing to a new resource group and a new Logic App name. So here's what that will look like once it's run. So it's built up my Logic App, it's deployed it to my Azure resource, and it's also deployed to my Arc resource. So if we go flick across to that resource group with my Azure Logic App and drill into that, we can see that the workflows that we were working on locally are now reflected here. Now I can now drill into my Arc resource, and to show that this is actually, it's all been deployed and all working well and good, we can have a look at that endpoint. This is running on a different URL. It's not a .azure website, it's one that we're used to. This is now running on my Kubernetes cluster. And thanks to our pipeline there, that same build artifact is running on this particular resource, as you can see here. Now to round it all out, I promised we'd get a really rich application map with the world of deploying resources on Azure and off Azure. There's got to be a way to bring this all together, and that's where Application Insights and Monitor comes in. So here I can get a really rich map of all of my different resources that I'm using in my integration services. So this is an example of that Azure map. You can imagine if we add things in like API-M or Azure Web Apps or something else in the Azure ecosystem, we can actually get that end-to-end view of everything that's happening within our ecosystem, whether it's running on Azure or on Arc-enabled Kubernetes clusters. I hope you're as excited as we are, and we look forward to hearing your feedback. So back to you, Jon.
That's great. Thank you, Beck. Azure Integration Services is an amazing set of technologies. It allows you to integrate your organization, but it's primarily driven by pro integrators or developers. But Azure Integration Services itself and Microsoft's set of capabilities extend far beyond just integration services in Azure. The Power Platform allows anybody, starting from anywhere in your organization, to be an integrator, an automator, or a developer without writing a line of code. The Power Platform allows you to be able to access integration services in Azure through APIs and events to really create a full spectrum of capabilities for every single person in your organization. There's an amazing number of benefits that this provides. And when you add in our application services and the ability to run them anywhere where you can run Kubernetes, your cloud, our cloud, their cloud, any cloud, on premises or on the edge. Integration services, application services, the Power Platform, Azure and Microsoft want to empower you to do your best work with the best capabilities we can provide. And today, Azure Integration Services is trusted by tens of thousands of customers. And if you're one of them, I want to send a heartfelt thanks for putting your trust in us to run your most critical workloads. And now I'd like to introduce a special guest to talk about his organization's journey with Logic Apps and Azure Integration Services. I'd like to give a very warm welcome to Neil Webb from ASOS. I'm working for a company who's at the vanguard of both technology and fashion. Hi, Neil.
Hi, Jon. Thank you. So just to kick off with a little bit about ASOS, I imagine a lot of people have probably already come across ASOS by now, especially if you're in the UK, but increasingly across the world too. You might have come across this background image on the slide before if you've ever encountered an ASOS parcel. For those that haven't, ASOS is an online retailer for fashion-loving 20-somethings. We've got web and app experiences, and they're currently supporting 24.9 million active customers in 200 countries across 10 languages. In the last financial year, ASOS processed 80.2 million orders. So ASOS is operating at a fairly large scale, and that brings along with it some fairly interesting technical challenges. Now, I've been working at ASOS as a solution architect for nearly 10 years now. So I've experienced a lot of ASOS's growth over that time, and I've been involved in what has been some quite significant changes to the underlying technology to support it. ASOS tech itself is split into a number of different areas or domains. I predominantly work with the teams in core e-commerce, and that is organized into a number of different platforms. I've tried to show some of those on the slide there for you. So there's the likes of the product platform, bag and checkout, orders. This is everything really from when you see a product on the product page through to placing your order. Now, the platforms really are just an organizational construct around groups of engineering teams that are building out, I suppose, what we would refer to as microservices. And they're the teams that I'm working with on a day-to-day basis. I guess the final thing to say about me, given that we're specifically talking about logic apps today, is I really don't consider myself an integration specialist or expert, and I've never worked in a role that's purely focused on integration. So I guess that begs the question, why am I here to talk about logic apps? So as I alluded to on the previous slide, ASOS has this kind of decomposed architecture, and I've tried to represent that here, obviously in a much more abstract form. There are many factors in terms of how you go about or influencing that decomposition and the boundaries between each of these services. But you can think of one of the typical services on the slide there as representing a discrete functional capability. And when people talk about this stuff, sometimes they like to talk in kind of DDD terms or use DDD terminology. So you can think of one of those services as representing maybe a single aggregate or multiple aggregates, or perhaps a coarser grain service might represent an entire bounded context. Now, the teams that look after these services look after all aspects of them. So they build them and they run them in production. So that means that they're interested in things like the compute, the underlying data stores, the CI/CD process and tooling, but also those operational aspects too. So the monitoring, alerting, scaling, etc. So that's all great. But one of the challenges that we all know exists with this type of architecture is that in order to realize a broader business process, so in the case of ASOS, buying the latest in ASOS design for your Friday night out, these services need to start talking to each other. And it's also really common as well for some of these services to need to start talking to external or third-party systems too. Remembering again that the service represents that entire functional capability as a vertical. So that might encompass off-the-shelf software or external or third-party systems too. On top of all of that, utilizing data from these services is becoming increasingly important. So I've shown a rather purpley looking data lake there. But ASOS actually these days is probably more aligned to the principles that sit behind what people refer to now as a data mesh. And that is where a service is responsible for its own data product that it will publish and then be responsible for maintaining in the data lake there. So I said at the start in the intro there that I don't consider myself an integration specialist. But actually, if you look at that diagram, there's quite a lot of integration-y type activity that's going on. And it's in some of these scenarios that logic apps can perhaps help out. So it's really common for a service to have a requirement to FTP or acquire some data from a third party, transform it, perhaps enrich it before ingesting it into one of those data stores there. And they're all capabilities that logic apps can easily provide for you. I'm also finding that a logic apps workflow is a really quick and easy way of building a message bridge. So we publish data between services traditionally on Azure Service Bus, but we quite like to use the Event Hub's capture functionality to land data into the data lake. So a logic apps workflow, you can literally create one in minutes to act as a message bridge, just to bridge those event streams from one messaging technology to another. That's not to say that you couldn't hand roll some of these interactions. Of course you can, but we're finding that the out-of-the-box connectivity and orchestration capability that logic apps offers is certainly worth considering, especially given that the deployment model itself is fairly decomposable and therefore fits quite well with this type of architecture and keeping that concern inside that service boundary. The technology as well is one that's going to be familiar to the engineers that are already building out these services within the Azure ecosystem. There have also been a number of improvements to logic apps recently that I think are now going under the name of single tenanted logic apps. And these make logic apps a bit more viable for some of these use cases where perhaps we might have shied away from them in the past. And I've tried to highlight some of the reasons why on the next slide. So sitting in the middle here, you've got scalability and performance. So the updates to the logic app's runtime mean that you now got this ability to run your logic app on an app service plan. And that, coupled with built-in actions and connectors, means that a lot of the throughput limits that we might have traditionally associated with logic apps have now been removed. And it really means that that conversation about scaling limits has now moved to really just how much infrastructure you want to provision and pay for. I've also called out stateless workflows here, which is something new with single tenanted logic apps. And these give you the ability to get increased performance if you don't have a requirement for the underlying durable state. And we've been finding actually combining stateless and stateful workflows has been quite a nice pattern to get some of the benefits from both of those worlds there. Hosting on an app service plan obviously also brings along with it all of the existing networking capabilities. So you've got things like your VNet integration and your private endpoints. And this just gives us the ability to get that enhanced security without having to go down the route of deploying to an integration services environment inside the VNet. So I focused on those first 2 points there really around the new hosting model and app service plans. But because the new runtime is built on top of the Azure Functions runtime, you can actually now run your logic app really wherever you like. Now, whilst the sort of true iPaaS nature of logic apps is obviously one of its appeals to a lot of people, you will have seen on the previous slide there when we were looking inside one of those services and we were looking at the compute, there was a little AKS icon. Now, ASOS is increasingly running a lot of its workloads on AKS, and having the ability to run a logic app's workflow there as well on the same compute that the rest of the service is using just means that we can get that increased density on the underlying infrastructure. That run anywhere capability obviously also extends itself to your local machine. Now, the reason I'm calling this out is, if I'm honest, the lack of local dev and test capability was a little bit of a blocker for some use cases for us in the past, just because we couldn't really put the engineering rigor that we wanted to around that development process. So we're really glad that some of those constraints have now been removed. So the final point that I thought is worthwhile mentioning is the new extensibility model. So you now have the ability to build your own built-in custom connectors, and these give you the capability really of running any code that you like inside your logic app workflow. Now, if you squint a little bit at the slide there and the screenshot on the end, you can see a built-in Cosmos DB connector. Now, that isn't something that you get out of the box right now, but it is something the ASOS team have been working on, and they hope to be able to contribute that back very soon. So all of these things combined really do make logic apps a much more viable choice for some of these use cases than perhaps it might have been in the past.
So, that's great, Neil. I really appreciate you walking everyone through your journey with logic apps and the new runtime. One thing you said that was really interesting is almost this Conway's Law problem of the technology that you use causing a representation in organizational structure. You talked about not being an integration specialist and how it was very appealing, the new runtime, in terms of not needing to feel like you needed to do that as your day job in order to get value out of our integration platform. Could you talk a little bit more about that?
Sure, yeah. I mean, I think we've seen this actually in a number of realms that we operate in. You know, there's been the microservices movement, the DevOps kind of movement. Actually, a lot of the principles behind, the data mesh that I mentioned there are similar as well, whereby traditionally, I think, organizations structured themselves around these technical capabilities. So you'd have your big integration team. Now, whilst integration is certainly a cross-cutting competency, and you certainly need experts that probably aren't me dealing with it, I believe that actually, we want to be structuring our teams really around that functional capability, and that functional capability is going to cover all of those concerns. It's going to cover DevOps, it's going to cover integration, it's going to cover data. And I think when you start looking at your organizational structure in that way, in order for those teams to be effective, really what you need is that cross-cutting competency to come in and give guidance on patterns and technologies and that sort of thing. And to a certain extent, Logic Apps helps enable that, because actually the learning curve isn't overly steep. You can have engineers that don't or haven't really been integration engineers in the past, and with a bit of guidance they can start building out these integration flows. And again, that isn't me saying that you don't need the integration competency, and they obviously need guidance on patterns and the like, and I know we've talked about that before, Jon, as well, in terms of documenting the sort of patterns, those enterprise integration patterns that you can implement on Logic Apps. So that's in my mind, that's the way I like to see the direction that I'd like to see things going.
That sounds great, and honestly, that really aligns with the way we think about integration as well. It shouldn't be sort of locked up in one team, in an organization that makes themselves a bottleneck for kind of satisfying the rest of the organization, but really putting the capabilities of integration in everybody's hands, right? So they all get value from it. So one of the other things you mentioned, Neil, was wanting to be able to run on Kubernetes, but being able to run on a managed service like AKS instead of having to deal with all the complexity of Kubernetes itself. With the Azure Arc investments we announced last week, how does that sort of resonate with you in terms of your own plans for being able to run Logic Apps anywhere?
So, I think one of the challenges that a lot of organizations have been struggling with is that whilst container orchestration brings with it a lot of benefits. I mentioned the density on the underlying infrastructure before, and just getting the most out of your infrastructure. The learning curve is quite steep, and operating a cluster requires a certain skill set. So whilst we are generally targeting running those workloads on AKS, any additional support that can be provided to make that that learning curve just a bit easier for your normal engineer adds a lot of benefit for us.
Great, yeah, and that really again speaks to our own roadmap and what we're pushing on, as people hopefully saw from Build last week, and we'll see at this event as well with some of the sessions we have running over the next 2 or 3 days. So with that, I'd like to say many thanks, Neil, for joining us here today at Integrate. Really appreciate partnering with you as a company, and you and your team at ASOS as well. It's been great working with you for the past few months as you've onboarded to the new Logic Apps runtime, and thank you very much. What to expect if you're new to Integrate? You have an amazing opportunity to hear directly from the people who build these products. You'll be able to ask questions and get answers across all of the services that I've talked about here. But more than that, you're also joined by an amazing group of MVPs. These are people who have the industry experience of the application of our technologies, who will share best practices and insights into how to make you more effective and more productive and more successful. And I'd like to thank everybody for participating in this event, because integration really is everything. And with that, I'd like to say thank you and enjoy the show. Goodbye.
Covey.co